Hi, my name's Ellie. Thanks for joining me today. Let me ask a question that most people never really consider, and let's just see what your immediate answer is before I've started today's show, and then later at the end of today's show. I want to see, quite frankly, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments, whether your answer to the question changes, among other things. Let's begin. So the question is, can you afford to leave the United States? That's the question. Not can you afford to go traveling, or can you afford to retire in a beautiful foreign place and kick your heels up and be at the beach every day drinking cocktails. That's not what I mean. I mean, can you afford to leave, to migrate to another country? Can you? It's really about, can you afford to stop struggling where you currently live, in a system that has been designed to keep you working harder and harder and harder for less and less reward. So from what I understand, and of course the caveat is that I'm here in Australia, but I have lived in the US in the past. And so I do know where to go looking for information. But from what I understand, if you're spending around about $2,000 a month right now, just to cover your basic expenses in the United States, and you still feel as though you're struggling, then you are probably and technically living below the federal poverty line. So, that's $24,000 a year. But globally, that same amount of money could give you a very comfortable, low-stress life in many other countries. So maybe the real question is, it isn't really can you afford to leave the United States. Perhaps the real question is whether you can afford to stay in the United States. And I have reasons for that, and I'm going to share them with you now. So let's break it down. Because there are a lot of people who are currently unhappy, and they're living in the United States. I understand the concept of patriotism. This is not me trying to tell you to hate your country or to leave your country or anything like that. And I know that there are many people who are not happy right now living in the United States, and they want to see their country, the country that they love, change for the better. But those are not the things that I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that day-to-day struggle that many people are experiencing in life, just because they cannot thrive in the United States and they can't seem to find a way to make it better. So the question really is, can you afford to leave if leaving promises you the opportunity for a better life? Or can you afford to stay? Can you afford to leave, or can you afford to stay? I'm going to be looking at both of those questions. So let's take a look at the first one. What could you do if you ever wanted to leave the United States? All right. Well, the first thing you'd need to do if you're already struggling is you'd need to immediately start cutting your expenses. Not just a little bit, but quite radically. You'd have to do things like sell your home, sell your car, get rid of all of your excess belongings. If it's something that you would have to leave behind, then you have to get rid of it now because it provides a potential income. You'd also have to downsize. You'd have to live very simply. You'd have to cook all of your meals at home, and you'd have to get rid of things that are considered to be surplus expenses like Wi-Fi or cable channel subscriptions or other types of subscriptions for things like entertainment, like streaming services and things like that. And you'd have to go to the library to use their free Wi-Fi, for example, and you'd have to find other ways to entertain yourself rather than anything that has any kind of subscription. Every single dollar that you spend, you'd have to consider it to be like a vote. And it's either being voted in favor of your future freedom, which is you leaving, or it's a vote in favor of you staying. And so every single dollar and every single penny. That's the first thing that you'd have to do. You'd have to make sure that you liquidated enough money to be able to actually and physically leave the United States. So next, you'd also have to start thinking about what happens after you leave the United States. So you need to start imagining the idea of starting somewhere new with a lower cost of living. Now, I've actually done this before. So I have relocated to an entirely different continent twice in my life. And I now live in the continent that I was born in. So I know what it's like to go to a brand new place and to start from the beginning. And I had a little hiccup actually when I moved to Britain. I moved from Australia to Britain and I had accommodation set up, but there was a problem when I got there. So I had to stay in a hotel unexpectedly. And for that first month that I stayed in a hotel, I used up all of my money, all of my money. But I got lucky because within 2 hours of arriving in Britain, before I went to sleep after the long haul flight, I did something quite proactive. I went through the job pages and I secured myself an interview within 2 hours of arriving in the country, and then I went to bed. And as it turns out, that interview led to a job, which means when I woke up and went to the interview, I had secured employment. But gosh, it was close, because by the time that very first payday came along, I was down to probably about $5, and that was it, in a hotel. So there you go. So I know what it really means to migrate with very little money overseas. So, okay, you need to imagine starting from scratch in a brand new place with a lower cost of living. And I'm using Asia as an example, predominantly Southeast Asia, but Asia overall, because there are actually a large number of people who come from Western first world democracies who have moved to Asia for exactly the reason that I'm bringing this up today, because they don't feel as though they can thrive in the United States or Britain or Australia, but primarily we're talking about the United States, and they feel that there's a much more cost-effective life expectation or privilege for them overseas. And so the first thing you'd have to think about is health insurance, because as someone who is coming from a foreign country, it's always a good idea to make sure that you do have health or medical insurance, particularly if you are in a family and have children. So for a parent and a child to have combined health insurance in Asia is going to average you around about $60 a month. We're going to add these things up. And then you need to be able to rent a place to live, and rent for a fully furnished apartment that has utilities and internet and maybe even a pool or a gym or both included. So, not a bad place to live, is generally going to cost you somewhere in the vicinity of $1,000 a month. Probably less, actually. If you're savvy and if you look as hard as you can and kind of get the word out, you probably would be able to get an apartment of that nature for between $850 and $1,000 a month. And then, of course, public transportation instead of a car, because having and owning a car in Asia is very difficult. It's a highly populated place. There's nowhere to put the car, but also most people don't drive cars. So they either have a moped or they take public transport. But public transport is probably going to be what you're using. And that would generally cost you less than $50 a month to be able to use public transport. Even the flight that you take to leave the country doesn't necessarily have to be expensive. So let's use scenarios. It's either two young parents and a child, or perhaps a retired couple. What I've done is I've kind of averaged them out to be approximately the same kind of cost in terms of that travel, one-way travel to the foreign country, because they're going to have different weights of priorities that affect them. And so flying for both of those scenarios, whether it's a 3-person young family or a retired couple, flying from the United States to Southeast Asia, for example, can be achieved for less than $1,000 combined. So that's everybody involved. And the way that you can actually save up your travel money to be able to relocate is through using the systems that are offered to you in the United States, but you have to be really diligent. So for example, diligent. I thought it came out funny. You have to be really diligent, right? You can save up things like travel rewards, or you can use buying club bonus points that are linked to travel and things like that. And what I understand would be the most recommended thing would be to purchase every single thing you can using that credit card or that buying club scenario, whatever it is that accrues travel miles or travel points. The catch is, though, if you use your credit card or anything that accrues interest, you would have to pay that debt every month before the interest accrues. So you're earning the points, but you're not paying the interest. And when the points accumulate to enough to be able to buy your tickets for 2 retired people or tickets for 3 young family travelers, then that would be, approximately $1,000. for the whole group to move, and you'd be able to use those points to be able to get a free ticket. But it does require a very close kind of diligence when it comes to how you spend your money and making sure you don't accrue interest, because the interest will kind of cancel out any savings that you make on those points. So that's actually quite cheap. It is a one-way ticket after all. And so if you add all of that stuff together, if you add the cost of travel, about $1,000, and then you add it to the cost of your transport and accommodation and medical insurance for the first month in Asia, then the initial costs for you to get to your new location and survive a month is around $2,200 US upfront, and that includes everyone. And then, of course, a subsequent $1,200 every month to be able to keep that going, because you've already used your $1,000 travel to get there, and then the $1,200 is duplicated every subsequent month. On top of that, your primary expenses are going to be things like food and entertainment, which is also much cheaper in Asia. So for example, in Vietnam, which I've been to and I know from first-hand experience, once you get outside of the tourist areas in Vietnam, going out for dinner is really cheap. And you probably wouldn't be going out for dinner very much because you'd want to save your money, you'd be cooking at home. But if you did go out for dinner, if you were going to a nice restaurant and eating multiple courses of good quality, freshly prepared, colourful foods that have lots of colourful fresh vegetables included, so lots of vitamins, and well prepared by a proper chef, it would probably be costing you somewhere between $10 to $20 per person, multiple courses. This is a lavish feast in Vietnam, so long as you're not in the tourist areas, because once you're in the tourist areas, you start paying tourist dollar. But, okay, so we've figured out our food, we've figured out our accommodation and our transport and our health requirements. What about sustaining yourself with that ongoing monthly expense? You have to have some form of income in order to keep that going. So, of course, that's the only way you're going to be able to stay. The thing about Asia in particular is you don't need to have a big salary to live in Asia. You just need to be imaginative. And for Westerners, for people in the United States, Britain or Australia who want to live in Asia, there are some imaginative, quite easy to accomplish types of income. Firstly, you could teach English as a second language. Teach English online in particular these days. I actually have a cousin who lived in China for a number of years, and that's how she paid her way, is she taught English to Chinese students as a second language. And she loved living in China, and it was quite affordable. She lived in a lovely apartment. She had no concerns whatsoever. In fact, she really enjoyed her life there. The only reason why she returned is because she suffered a very severe chronic illness that then caused her to miss home and want to be closer to family and things like that. And so she relocated back. But I think until she had experienced that illness, I think she was feeling quite settled where she was and probably would still be there now. So other than teaching English as a language online, you could just use whatever skill you currently are being paid for or have been paid for in the past to freelance. So in any way that you offered value to the workplace, in a former or current life in the United States, you could use that on a freelance basis in that foreign country. I know multiple people who've actually done that. I know people who are working in Dubai, which is a very expensive place to live, but I know people who are using their employment skills as freelancers in a variety of different countries around the world. And a lot of the time, they're actually getting paid more overseas than they would have received in their own home country for doing exactly the same job. Any kind of knowledge that you have, professional knowledge, can be turned into a freelance opportunity. You could also use the internet to sell products, whether they're physical products or creative products or digital products or anything. And on places like Etsy and eBay and places like that. But you'll notice there are a lot of people here on YouTube who are also capitalizing on their move abroad by documenting it in vlogs. You can do this on TikTok, on YouTube, on Facebook, anywhere. And you can do it on Substack. You can actually create your history and your diary and turn it into a money-making enterprise, because people are really interested to know how to achieve the thing that you've achieved, especially if you're thriving in a foreign country. So this is another way to be able to do that, to be able to monetize your experiences of relocating on some kind of an internet platform. And then another way that you'd be able to make an income, which is often achieved by people from, say, the United States as an example, is you could actually do customer service for an English-speaking company that has their customer service staff located in that foreign country. That's something that's happening really frequently these days. A lot of American companies, not just American, Australian and British, but primarily American companies, are moving their call centers into cheaper countries where the labor is cheaper. And but their customers still want to hear a local sounding voice. And so you would probably be in demand working as a customer service professional in, say, for example, an Asian country. And you also would be earning more than the average Asian wage because you would have the advantage of working for the American company in an Asian country. So you would be at the top of your game in terms of being able to have that appeal for customers who want to hear a voice that sounds familiar or an accent that sounds familiar. And you have great knowledge of the temperament and the lifestyle of the people that you're talking to. But you also are local. You can live on $10 an hour in a very comfortable way in Asia, as opposed to living at the poverty line in the United States. And so the figure means a lot overseas, whereas it's certainly not enough to survive and thrive in the US. So in places like Vietnam and Malaysia and other Asian countries, this is something that is very doable. There are caveats, and the major caveat is you will have to give up some things. So it's very doable, but these are some of the things that I've identified that you will definitely have to give up if you want to leave the United States and move to a simpler life, for example, somewhere like Southeast Asia. You'd probably have to give up a car. Mostly, like I said, this is because the population and storage is very difficult. It would be difficult and expensive to run a car. It also is probably unnecessary in most cases. People who do drive at all tend to drive mopeds or motorbikes, and then most people also just use public transport, which is quite affordable. Other luxuries would include things like, top of the range mobile phones or upgrading your iPhone every year and tablets and things like that. And the range of gadgets that people use that kind of are like status symbols that make them feel as though they've accomplished something. These are things that you'd probably have to sacrifice. You would also most likely have to give up the expensive address that you might want to live in, because the whole point is to live simply. So you'd be out there in the average world with the average Asian population living in average type of housing, which is very affordable, very realistic and doable. It's just not going to be the expensive address that you would achieve, say, in the tourist areas. But what you get in return is you get a lot of breathing space. You get good quality food, and the food in Asia, for example, is generally much better quality. If you're living at the lower income range, you are most likely, almost definitely, not eating the same quality of food as someone in Asia would be eating on a very similar salary. And you would also be experiencing far less financial stress because your life would just be a lot simpler, a lot simpler. So the question is, if it's that easy to leave the United States, why don't more people just leave? Well, I think you'll find that a lot of people do leave, but there are even more people who want to leave, but they're afraid to. The system teaches people that leaving is impossible. It kind of tells us that we're too broke, or we're too dependent, or there are too many things to be afraid of. It convinces the average American that expenses are kind of universal, that the expenses that you have as an American are going to be the same if you live overseas. But that's actually not true. Even here in Australia, life is much simpler and less expensive than the US. We do tend to copy the US, and it's creeping up slowly with every year. But even when the prices look really high in Australia, the ways in which people get their income and the rates of income, and also the various socialist, I guess you could say, safety nets that are available for people that are provided by the Australian government, overall, it makes life generally much more affordable to live in Australia than it does than to live in the United States. I actually did a comparison between the US, the UK, Germany and Australia on a variety of different characteristics affecting the population in my book, Truth Lies in Twilight, the Prophecy, because it was relevant to one of the prophecy statements from that prophecy that I encountered in the 1980s. And so if you have that book, you'll see that there have been numerous studies done between all of the countries in the world, but I just happen to pick those 4 countries as examples to compare life expectancy, cost of living, the level of stress that's encountered, the safety nets that are available between countries and things like that. And so there is a lot of difference between the United States, which is probably one of the most stressful countries to live in, and some of those comparators, which you may not have access to as much stuff, as much in the way of luxury expectation or a sense of hustle that you have to do in order to achieve things. But what you will have is you will have a slightly simpler, more relaxed kind of life as a result of it, with more safety nets available just in case something goes wrong. But the thing is, the stories that we're being told that it's not possible to leave the United States because there's just too many things to be worried about, that is not actually true. You can actually reset your life and you can start fresh. You can trade that US hustle mentality where you kind of have to just keep hustling for something, for a culture that is less materialistic, more peaceful, and much, much simpler. You're paying for the privilege of remaining stuck in a perpetual cycle that is very difficult to get out of. All right, so we're going to look now at the other question, which is the opposite. Rather than saying, can you afford to leave the United States? We're going to look at the question of, can you afford to stay in the United States? And in order to look at this, we need to kind of go back to look at the bigger picture. And I've chosen Aristotle, the ancient philosopher, who warned us about something that's happening in the phenomenon, which is the United States. He gave us this warning around 2,000 years ago. Aristotle feared that the oligarchy would be more of a detriment to the people than tyranny. Because while tyrants rule by force and are obvious because of that, oligarchs, they don't use force. They're kind of Machiavellian. A tyrant tends to focus on something and they're easy to spot. Oligarchs, on the other hand, they rule the people, but they do it in a different day. They rule the people with influence and with manipulation, and they hide. They hide in the background. And because they're hiding, they often get overlooked. The detriment that oligarchs are causing to the population is being overlooked because they hide behind the legal system and various laws. They hide behind the branding for the organizations that they own, that kind of, the big friendly brand of washing powder that you've always grown up with and things. Well, there's an oligarch probably sitting behind that brand. And also the institutions that they have created. There's a variety of different institutions. You have the military establishment, you have the educational establishment, you've got all different, hospital establishment, you've got all kinds of establishments that actually have oligarchs sitting behind them. They smile at the people, kind of like wolves in sheep's clothing. They smile at the people in glossy photographs on magazine or on the internet. They conduct really sharp interviews and they look really savvy with their state-of-the-art sunglasses or their brand new sports car. But at the same time, what they're actually doing is they're strangling the people, or the average population of the country, with things like corporate monopoly and price gouging and strategic mergers that are making single corporations bigger and bigger and bigger and slowly wiping out the little guy and the small business person, creating a lack of competition out there so that they can grab everything for themselves. What Aristotle said, he said, the true friend of the people should see that the people not become too poor. Now, what this means is that the way to measure the strength of a population is to measure the progress of the people at the lowest end of the scale. And if you're a friend of the country, you will try and elevate the lowest end of the scale because that's how you strengthen the country, is by strengthening the people. The true friend of the people who should ensure that the people do not become too poor. That was Aristotle's view. Do you think the oligarchs are, by measurement, a true friend of the people? If the oligarchs aren't really the true friend of the people, it makes the Trump phenomena look a little bit different because, well, a little bit different than how it's being described in the media. All right, so Donald, don't get me wrong, Donald is definitely a tyrant and I am not his biggest fan. So, and he is dangerous, but he also threatens the oligarchy as much as he threatens the average person. And I find that interesting. And the reason why we know that he's a threat to the oligarchy is because of the stock market. You can always tell who is a status quo player by how they react to news about the stock market. Because the stock market is a measurement of how well the rich people are doing. It really has very little, maybe even nothing, to do with the average person. The measurement of a country's true strength and the state of its democracy is the measurement of the average everyday people. And if they're struggling, if the average everyday people are struggling, then regardless of the stock market, the country is in decline and the democracy is crumbling. So when people freak out about the stock market, just remember that what they're really doing is they're demonstrating their status quo state. And they are freaking out on behalf of the oligarchy because the oligarchy is afraid. And it just kind of puts everything into a slightly different perspective. So when the middle class begins to collapse, then democracy collapses with it. And what happens is you don't get a revolution in that case. What you get is a kind of learned helplessness. People sit back and they think to themselves, well, this is just the way it is, and I can't do anything about it, and I feel hopeless and powerless and things like that. So people stop trying because they don't know what to do. They just lie there and they take it. They feel powerless. So in order to afford to live in the United States, something has to change if people feel that they're struggling now. And they also have to ask themselves, are they just struggling now, or have they been struggling for 10 years, or have they always struggled? Have the generations before them struggled? Did their mother and father struggle and then they inherited that legacy of struggle? Because then you can't really pin that struggle on a person. You pin it on the system of democracy that has been inherited, that becomes part of the status quo and goes around and around. It's really important to ask yourself that question. In order to live in the United States, what can I change, if anything? So what could be changed in order to get out of this and lift the country out of this status quo struggle? Well, the very first thing that I think would probably need to change is there would need to be a separation of money from politics. I don't think this is an unpopular view. I think a lot of people understand it's a problem. For example, the Citizens United ruling by the Supreme Court that determined in some weird, freakish way that a corporation is a person. That companies are people. Well, companies are not people. Companies are companies and people are people. And that would need to be reversed. That ruling would need to be reversed so that it's one person, one vote, rather than one company, one vote, and lobbying rules the day, and corporations are exempt and things. The Citizens United ruling probably is one that has caused a tremendous amount of detriment to the country and has made dark money a kind of an epidemic problem in the US. There would also need to be a change to the tax system. So extreme wealth, the highest earners in the country would need to be taxed at a much, much higher rate to prevent them from being able to dominate. And the focus of education would also need to change. So, it's really nice to learn mathematics and English and even home economics or something like that, but teaching something like civic education from a really young age, media literacy from a really young age, and how to organize, like life organization skills, would be far more powerful when it comes to a person's strengthening as they're growing than the current curriculum of history and geography and science and that kind of thing. Those things are great too, but the most important thing is to train young people from the earliest possible learning ages how to be more aware of what's really influencing their life and how to be empowered within that influencing situation. And then, of course, culturally, there would need to be a change in perspective of the country. So the country would need to, I know the country has its published values, but its actual values are often unspoken, and those real values would need to change. So, for example, prioritizing the people who really do make a difference. So teachers and nurses and social workers and public servants and things like that, they would need to be the ones who are celebrated as the real achievers, rather than, for example, the Kardashians. No, I've got nothing against the Kardashians, but celebrating the Kardashians and making them rich and famous because somebody once had a beautifully sized and shaped bottom and then it just sort of went from there seems kind of like a strange set of values, doesn't it? And then billionaires should be recognized for what they give back to the community rather than what they take from the community, or how rich they are, or what kind of car they drive, or how many beautiful wives they've ever had, or something like that, or how many children they're able to biologically reproduce. A billionaire should be measured by the worth that he brings into the community that raises those who need it the most. And rather than focusing on this legacy of national journalism that kind of runs a theme throughout the country, and things like television hosts and on-air talent, there should be more support for the news-driven, investigative reporting that takes place at the local level. Real reporter journalism that's kind of hard-hitting and adventurous, kind of your Lois Laney kind of thing. Because people really need to know what's actually happening in close proximity to where they live, and what's actually happening that has a direct influence on their life. And it's the local journalism that actually makes a lot of difference to people's lives. And of course, the way that you measure the strength of a country, like I said, is by measuring the progress of the people who live at the lowest scale. If life for the poorest people is getting better, then the country is improving. But if the life of the poorest people is not getting better, then the country is failing its population. So think about how long you've really been experiencing either a strengthening of your own personal situation or a weakening of your own personal situation. Chances are it's been going on for longer than a year, longer than 5 years, longer than 10 years. It may very well have been going on for a few decades. That means it's a systematic issue, and a single person or a single political party or a single issue is probably not going to resolve it. It has to do with a change in complete perspective. So to be able to live in the United States, the real question isn't really to worry about the status quo, like the stock market, for example, and how democracy might be crumbling. Democracy only really exists in a country when the perspectives that I've just mentioned are put in place to raise the ordinary people up. And so despite being called a democracy, is a country really a democracy if it favors the rich at the expense of the poor, and does it increasingly and increasingly and increasingly? I'm not telling you the answer, I'm just asking the question, and that's the reason why I want to hear from you in the comments. It's not for me to say, because I don't live in the United States. I did live in the US, but I don't now. It is for the American people to answer this question. Can you afford to live in the United States? Can you change what needs to be changed? Can you live in it as it currently exists? This isn't about tearing the US down and tearing down your perspective. It's about focusing on what needs to be built up. Something better than the status quo. Because freedom isn't something that's given to you like a gift. It's a practice. It's something that has to be activated in order for it to be accomplished. And democracy isn't really a system. Democracy is a commitment that has to be adhered to time and again with the decisions that are made in everything that happens in the country. And then we've got this issue of justice. But justice isn't just about the legal system or about laws and legislation and policy. Justice is a choice that we make every day. We have to choose to activate that justice. So let me ask you again, can you afford to leave the United States? Because maybe the answer is yes. But then again, maybe there's a better question, and that is, can you afford to stay in the United States? Now, none of us have all the answers, but sometimes the first step towards real meaningful change is knowing that you're not crazy for thinking what you've been thinking. If something's been in your head, sometimes you may not realize what you've been thinking until someone like me comes along and says what you've been thinking out loud. And so then my next question is, I wonder if this video has shaken something loose for somebody out there. Do let me know in the comments. And if you're missing my tarot card readings, don't worry, you're not alone. You can still find them on Patreon several times a week. I'm still posting. It's a long story, and eventually I explain it all. Anyway, welcome to the new world. This is Ellie, Dreams Down Under. I love knowing you're here, and I'll see you in my dreams.